Probably everyone thinks they're open to new ideas and change. Yet human nature tells us to hate new stuff. That was a great quote that we heard from Steve Lerch, who was a speaker at the NACS SOI Summit, the State of the Industry Summit that took place earlier in April. We heard from a bunch of people that said, you need to have Steve on the show. Well, we did, and we're going to replay the episode that we had with him on. He talked about AI, he talked about storytelling. He said, be curious, be aggressive, find information, and enjoy. We've talked a lot about AI over the past years, whether in podcasts or in NACS stages. Today, we're going to cover AI, but we're also going to cover the story elements. How do you make AI interesting? How do you make data interesting? Joining us is Steve Lerch. He is president of Story Arc Consulting. And not only is he our guest today, he is one of the featured speakers at the NACS State of the Industry Summit, which will be taking place April 8th through 10th in Dallas. If you are not registered, you want to. After you hear this, you will doubly want to. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here and excited to head down to Dallas in a few months.
I started out by mentioning AI, which is a huge topic in all industries. And it's also something that you are looking at because it ties into how do you tell stories, how you look at data, how do you lead innovation? So let's start with AI, which kind of went from it's coming to what are you doing about it now? How do you look at AI in the big picture?
Yeah, you're right that it's kind of here. It's not coming anymore. It's here. And the truth is, I think all of us have been overwhelmed or inundated by constant conversations about artificial intelligence in every corner of our work and our culture. And but I think the problem, at least from my perspective, that we're having right now, and certainly I'm a storyteller by trade. I give speeches, I tell stories. So I think a lot about how information gets communicated to people. One of the problems I see right now is that so many of the conversations about artificial intelligence, when it comes to our businesses and our industries, are these sort of grandiose, future-driven, how is AI going to transform our our software systems, our data stacks? And that's all true and that's all great. But those conversations leave out the 98% of us who, let's be honest, don't understand any of that stuff. We don't know how our business's software stack works and how the data is processed. And because that's the conversations people are having, so many of us aren't fully engaging with the artificial intelligence and the AI tools that are available to us right now, that available to the everyday person right now. So my obsession with AI is not about these crazy software integrations. It's about how can I, as a person with moderate to below average tech skills, use ChatGPT for free tomorrow to do my job a little better, a little faster, a little quicker. So that's kind of my obsession with AI. It's like taking it out of this super complicated, super technical side, which makes sense because it is a super complicated, super technical product. But how do we kind of ignore that for a minute and just focus on what we can use right now?
So the NACS State of the Industry Summit, a lot of people think of that as a metrics conference, data conference. And yes, it is. There's a lot of look at what happened in 2024, not just in our industry, but what happens in the broader economy, what happens over here. But data, we all know, if you have a loyalty program, if you have something like that, there's data overkill. There's too much data. There's not enough analysis. So how do we move? What kind of things do you talk about when you speak or when you interact with companies? How do you take it from data to here's a tool to take advantage of that data, and then the output is a story?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And certainly there's AI implications of that and non-AI implications of that. I think, I've been giving speeches for, 7 years or so now. And some of the topics I cover can be data intensive, can be quite technical. We talk about innovation. I talk about marketing. A lot of that stuff relies a lot on data. think what I've learned going to a couple hundred conferences over the last year, and you see speakers and you see economists and you see professors share data, is that sometimes the smartest people in the world get on stage and kind of, to your point, they might have 50 slides with 50 charts and 50 graphs, and it's probably wonderfully important information that's insightful and important and valuable to the people in the room, but nobody remembers any of it. To your point, we overload on quantity and we maybe under prioritize quality, and I think sometimes that's the problem when we're looking at these big reports and these big data sets. We want to use all of it. We want to understand all of it, when in reality, pulling out the two things that are really impactful, that we can really understand, that we can really share in a meaningful way, that we can really apply in a meaningful way. Really grasping and utilizing two things is far better than skimming over 50 or telling people 50. And not to bring everything back to artificial intelligence, but AI can help solve for some of these challenges. I was doing a project recently for here in DC for a corner of the federal government, working with NOAA. I always forget what NOAA stands for, National Oceanic Atmospheric something or other.
The hurricane guys.
Yeah, the hurricane guys. Those very important guys. I just don't know their acronym. I showed them this thing about, they produce weekly reports and tons of reports on weather, on the ocean tides, on all sorts of stuff. And a lot of it's very dense and very complicated. I did this thing just using the free version of, I can't remember if I used Gemini or ChatGPT, but I provided the link to like a 40 or 50 page report that they had published. And I asked ChatGPT to not only summarize that report, and I think I asked for maybe 150 words, but I said, if we were going to share this report with the general public on Facebook, the average person who doesn't understand this stuff, what's like the tagline I would use? What's the takeaway? What are the 5 bullet points to synthesize and summarize all of this data? And not only give me the 5 points, but translate it into a very human context, into words that the average person can understand, that would get them interested in this topic.
The title of your company has story in it, story arc. And story is, to me, having its moment right now. You hear that there are people in corporations now that are chief storytellers, and that is their job. And you're talking about bullet points and boiling something down to something that people can remember. So bullet point story, kind of the same thing. You got to have something that somebody remembers, because it's a social media era we live in, where here's 20 seconds. That's all I'm going to pay attention to. I'm not going to. Yes, there are exceptions where somebody will listen to a 3-hour podcast, but it's like very short attention span. How do you cut through the clutter, etc.? Doesn't story basically address some of the things that in a direction that we're moving now, where people do get a lot of information and they don't know how to necessarily tough word to say, synthesize things?
Yeah. My background before I got into giving speeches and talking about innovation and talking about AI, I'm a marketer by trade. Like that's where I started my career at Google, and digital advertising, marketing strategy. And so I've spent my entire career thinking about how to take messages and put them in formats and on platforms that the average consumer or the potential customers we're targeting will relate to and connect with, and most importantly, will pay attention to. And I think so much of the time when I think about how we tell a story, whether it's about AI or about the data or about your business, so much of it comes back to the idea is, will people pay attention long enough to hear it? And will people pay attention deeply enough, thoroughly enough to hear all of it? I think one of the failings of so many storytellers, whether that be someone like me who gives a speech, or whether that be a marketer, or to your point, the chief storyteller at a company who's maybe in charge of the brand, or someone who's got a data report they're trying to share and they're telling the story of that data or those scientific findings, that research study, is that they don't prioritize what's interesting to people. They don't make it fun. They don't connect it back to who those people are. They prioritize the facts. They prioritize the figures. They prioritize what they want to say and not what people want to hear. And I think in our sort of modern society, like this I don't know, TikTok driven society where the next piece of content is one swipe away. And after 1 second, if I don't like this thing, I'm on to the next one. Like that really does affect how we interact with each other and how we consume content and how we consume stories. So, everyone who's telling a story kind of has to be a little bit of a performer and a little bit of an actor and a little bit of a comedian. And, it doesn't, not to say it always has to be funny or always has to be jokes, but we have to think more about, yes, I want to tell this story, but what's the story my audience wants to hear? How does my audience want to hear it? And how can I take my facts and fit it into their world? And not the other way around. It's not the audience's job to come listen to us. It's our job to deliver something the audience wants to hear. So we have to customize to them and not the other way around. And again, I think that's a sort of a universal truth for anyone telling a story, marketing, sharing data. It reflects in what we all do.
So I thought it was interesting you mentioned comedians, and it's not about necessarily being funny. It's not like, hello, I just flew in from out of town. My arms are tired. But
I mean, don't get me wrong. That's a great way to start too. I mean, that's a great classic joke.
Yes, but it's really more about, if you think about it, what comedians do is they workshop things. They before
Sure.
they do a national TV appearance, the biggest names or up and coming, they go to a local club. They try out their jokes. Do they resonate? So how do business people do the equivalent of comedians and workshop something? Is it a matter of trying it on peers, trying it on family, just practicing? How do you get to figure out, once you know that you want the message to resonate with consumers and not what you want to say, how do you know you have a good story as opposed to that story that puts people asleep?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And my first thought when I heard it, because you talked about, practicing, and is it with friends, family, whatever it is. There's a really great story from the motivational speaker, Tony Robbins. And I won't tell the whole story, but the gist of it is that he was, in a previous life, an early job, he was trying to get better at the job. So he started doing the thing he was trying to do, which was sales pitches, way more frequently, and he to get better at it. And he realized after some amount of time that essentially he wasn't getting any better at it. And he said, essentially, that's when he realized that practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes consistent. Practice plus feedback makes perfect. So when I think about sort of your question and about, as you said, whether, let's say it's business people just giving presentations at meetings with small groups of 4 and 5 people. Yes, it's great to practice. Yes, if you want to rehearse, great. Yes, if you want to run it by your buddies or your wife or your kids, great. But what I think really matters is listening and observing and taking in the feedback you get when you actually do the thing, paying attention to how people react, listening to the questions they ask, asking them after the meeting, asking them after the speech for feedback, asking them what they remembered, asking them what they thought. Feedback is such a crucial part of, I think, improving anything. Again, I speak about innovation sometimes, and we talk a lot about this concept of the importance of feedback, and that it's a largely free, hugely beneficial thing that's sitting out there if you pay attention to it, if you go ask for it. So I think that's a big part of it to me is, yes, practice is great, but if you just practice, you're going to get really, really consistent. You have to get other inputs, so you got to listen. And sometimes it's very deliberate, and people are literally saying, here's my feedback, here's my advice. But sometimes it's facial expressions, and sometimes it's when did people yawn, and sometimes it's when did people check their phones, and when did people lean in. Sometimes you can notice that stuff if you really pay attention.
Yeah, the February issue of the NACS magazine is about advocacy, and I wrote an article about how do you look at things, just exactly what you're talking about, and it's not necessarily going to a comedy club and practicing, but I said there's all kinds of different ways to practice, and one of them is the chiropractor. I go to the chiropractor every now and then. Fly enough planes, your neck always hurts, and this is flying a plane as opposed to me, flapping my arms, but. One of the things is every time I go to the chiropractor, he's always like, how's work? It's a standard thing. Most people do work that go there. So he doesn't really necessarily care about work. It's just something to get you to talk so that it's not, awkward silence the whole time. And I'll kind of try out some things on him. And if he pauses for a second and goes, that's interesting, then then it's like, oh, that kind of worked on the general public. So I want to keep that one there. And I'm not like using him. It's still a normal conversation, but there's all kinds of ways to find the cues, and it doesn't have to be, let me practice this in front of you to see what works. It's exactly what you said. It's like somebody stops doing what they're doing and says, oh, you got me there. That's good.
So to your point about the chiropractor and what's getting his attention and what's sort of getting him to say, oh, that's interesting. A lot of it comes back to goals too. Like, what's the goal of what you're trying to communicate, and what reaction do you want from those people? And so I think that's a big part of it too. This practice in collecting feedback is making sure you understand what you're trying to accomplish, what you want the takeaway to be, and see if that's landing and seeing if that's coming through. And like I said, maybe if it's practicing with somebody in everyday life, like your chiropractor, it's just, what's interesting? What got interest? Because that's the lever I need to the points we were making earlier to tell that story about the more complicated data thing. So understand your own goals is a really important part of getting that relevant feedback.
So we can talk about any one of these topics for way longer than the length of this podcast. So I know, kind of jumping around, we talked about AI, we talked about storytelling, but I also want to cover culture. And the reason that's important is your previous job was at Google, and that was a critical part of what you were all about. And if there are three things that are going on right now in business that are talked about more than anything else besides, say, profit, it's storytelling, it's AI, and it's culture. Because you have to have people that like doing what they're doing. And I assume that's also part of storytelling and just supporting people. Talk a little bit about like what culture means to you in how you played it out when you were at Google and your post-Google career.
Sure. Yeah. And for me, I mean, of course, culture means so many different things. But, when I first left Google and first started giving speeches, the very first speech I sort of put together, it was called Innovation Through Culture, Stories from a Decade at Google. And I sort of became obsessed at my time at Google about this idea of how culture drives innovation. Because I'm not a technical guy. I'm not an engineer. I don't know how to code. But I was so fascinated in the way Google goes from search engine to smartphone apps to self-driving cars, this what I perceived as innovation. And over my time at Google, I sort of studied that process, the history of Google, how we got to where we are. And what I increasingly found, and eventually I was asked to start speaking to new employees when they came in about sort of this idea of how innovation can be driven through culture. Because what I found is when you want to have a culture like Google where people are ambitious and trying new things and embracing change and new ideas, it really, truly, truly, truly does start with people, not with code, not with robots, not with engineers. It starts with people. It starts with how we empower each other. It starts with how we facilitate collaboration. It starts with how we ask questions and show our curiosity. There's these very human elements of culture that can drive all that other stuff, that set the tone for all that other stuff. And at its core, what I think Google did well, at least while I was there, what I try to do now and what I work with companies on when I work on innovation projects, it's really about, like I said, it's about openness, it's about collaboration, it's about sort of freedom to ask questions, to pursue things that interest you, to find out those things you're curious about and give people the platform to chase them down. That sort of openness and flexibility. And like I said, just collaboration. I use that word so often, but to me, that's what a culture needs to look like, especially right now in 2025, when the world is changing so fast and so unpredictably. It's so important that you have a culture that's sort of ready to react to that and is adaptive and ready to innovate. And again, if you're not setting the tone for those cultural principles, it's going to be really hard to keep up with some of these changes that are going on in the world today. So that's kind of what culture means to me. And I took a lot of it from what I learned at Google and from some of the other companies I work with. But I love that topic. And I think it's so core to accomplishing so many other things.
So speaking, you had just mentioned onboarding people, and you think about, it's been a while for me. I've been at NACS 25 years, so it's been a while since I've gone through an orientation.
That's a good run.
Yeah, well, It has been. So when you look at a lot of new employees, they come in and there's orientation. They meet with different departments. They learn how to do things. I remember in orientation I had more than 25 years ago, the whole orientation was spent around, these are tactics. Don't do this. Make sure you do this. And none of it was really around, this is who we are and this is what makes us amazing. Is there something that you would recommend to any business that they look at differently, what that first day, week, month looks like for new employees, so that they're immediately grounded in, this is a different company. I get what they believe in, and I'm so glad I made this decision and not that other opportunity I had?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sure even at Google as well. And again, my personal orientation at Google would have been in 2010. So it's been a while since I went through the entirety of it. But just like any other company, and just like what you're describing, there were all those tactical conversations too. And you talk about your HR benefits and all that stuff, of course. Mm-hmm. But I did think that the culture conversation was really important. And I think it kind of comes back even to some of what we talked about already around understanding goals and understanding, what do you want from these people? One of the core things I used to talk about during these orientations was this idea that Google doesn't have an innovation team. That's not a thing at Google. There's not an innovation team. So when you look at Google and you say, oh, innovative company, always doing these new things and cracking these new frontiers, there's not like one team. There's not one chief innovation officer who's in charge of like saying, oh, this should be next and here's how we should evolve. And part of the reason we have that conversation is to make them understand that they're on the innovation team. All 150,000 employees are on the innovation team. And then, as we sort of story tell and go through this process, the things I would talk about with them is helping them see situations at Google and even at other companies where some random person on some random team had an idea, and that idea didn't have to do with their job or their team, or it was outside the box, or it was weird, or it was crazy. And they found a way to pursue it, and they found tools, and it was impactful, and it had a ripple effect, and it changed things. And there's a great story at Google about this young woman I forget what team she was on. I think maybe it was a communications team, who in essence, and I won't go through the whole story, but at the core of it, she essentially started Google's, what is now one of the largest private shuttle systems in North America, busing like tens of thousands of Googlers to and from work every day across California. She essentially started that process by building a carpool for a few other workers in the earliest days of Google, and then kind of expanding her carpool over time when she saw the need for it. It wasn't her job. It was just something she thought would help, and she ran with it and was given the reins to run with it. And that's the type of story I want people starting at my company to understand. I want them to understand, like, this stuff is encouraged, but it's also kind of expected. If you have some idea, you're expected to share it. You're expected to be curious. You're expected to pursue it. Because like I said, you're on the innovation team. Everybody is. So I think, again, understanding the goals, understanding what you want from your people, and making sure they understand that that's okay, that's exciting.
And it's sometimes the idea that leads to the idea. And there's perfectionism, I think, in all the great businesses. But like examples like the guys who founded Reddit, originally they set up to figure out how to create some sort of mechanism to order sandwiches from the convenience store chain Sheetz while they're filling up their gas tank. And it didn't work. They were in college, and the professor says, no, this isn't going to work. Figure out something else. And they said, okay, well, we got this idea for Reddit. Let's do that. And that kind of worked out well. So it's the idea that leads to the idea. There's all kinds of examples about whether it's a restaurant, and they started cooking this and it expanded to something else, and it's something bigger. But I think it's really important to have that culture where ideas are embraced, and there really are no bad ideas unless they have a really bad potential for a mistake. But it's, how do you elevate them?
Yeah, you're speaking my language for sure. Not only because you talked about sheets, and I grew up in the Philly area, so I grew up in a area where Wawa is like
Hmm.
church. But I went to college at the University of Pittsburgh, where Sheets is all the go. So those are sort of my two convenience stores of choice. But you're also speaking my language. This idea of, and you said there's no bad ideas, and it's interesting. I think what I often say to people is sometimes there are bad ideas, but bad ideas are so often the jumping off point of your good idea. There's this story where Jeff Bezos sent an email to 1,000 Amazon customers in 1998, I want to say, asking them what Amazon should sell next. At this point, Amazon only sold books and CDs and DVDs. Somebody responded to his email and said windshield wiper blades. The email literally said, what do you wish you could buy on Amazon? And he said, windshield wiper blades, because right now my car needs new windshield wiper blades. And I always say at its core, that is a bad idea. If Amazon sold books, DVDs, and windshield wiper blades, it'd be the weirdest website ever. But Jeff Bezos will tell you.
Logo, yeah.
Yeah. But Jeff Bezos will tell you to this day that it was that idea that triggered the idea in his head that the thing doesn't really matter. It's about need and it's about timeliness. And people would buy anything through e-commerce. We should sell everything. So I always say, like, to sort of connect back to this culture idea and about how you onboard employees, such an important part of culture is getting people comfortable sharing their bad ideas, their half-baked ideas, the ideas that they don't know if they're good, the ideas that they don't know if they're possible, or they don't know if there's budget for it. Creating a culture, and it's hard to do because everybody likes to polish up their ideas before they share them, but sharing those weird thoughts, those crazy ideas, those half-baked things is so valuable to the process of brainstorming, to the process of innovation, because you don't know what someone can build off of your starting point. So yeah, that's, like I said, you're speaking my language, and I think that's such a big part of culture is like that psychological safety to share what you're thinking, even if it's weird, even if it's quote unquote bad.
Mm-hmm. And just have the ability within the organization to say, that's cool. I'd rather hear that than not hear that. And let's think about that and let's move it forward, because everybody comes from a different context. Everybody has a different experience, years of experience and experience in life. And that's how you get the best ideas.
So true. I do some brainstorming workshops for companies when I work on innovation. And one of the things I always say, like the very beginning, I say a bad idea is way better than no idea. We'd so much rather hear from you, even if it's silly and stupid. It's so much better than keeping it in your head. Because like you said, your perspective is probably more valuable than you realize. Your experience is more valuable than you realize. And the most valuable thing that so many of us have is that our perspective and our experience is unique to us. We're the only ones who have that. So share it, talk about it.
Yep. And your story is unique and it's irrefutable. And that's one of the things that we say all the time. It's like, it's not just the numbers, it's the story. And you have that story and nobody can say that is not true. So, Steve, I want to thank you for joining us today. And when we talk about bad ideas and good ideas, I'll give you a good idea that is definitely a good idea. Go to the NACS State of the Industry Summit, April 8th through 10th in Dallas. Steve will be speaking there, touched upon a little bit of what he'll talk about, but he's going to go much more in depth there. It is time well spent. You will enjoy it. Now, just wrapping up one quick thing. When we talk about orientations, we have different orientations here at work, and we have some coming up. What I always ask, besides talking about what our department does, I always have one question for them. I say, think about the 7-Eleven logo. And I just picked 7-Eleven because, it's known by a lot of people. The 7-Eleven logo has all capital letters except for one. And what letter is that? This is not a quiz. I'm not going to ask you to answer, Steve. But, I knew one employee who said the I wasn't going to work out because there's no I in 11. But besides that, that employee's not at NACS anymore. It's just my way. It seems to work in getting people to go, that's interesting. I want to learn more. And then you have that first connection to the industry that you can hopefully keep pulling at and pull them in deeper, because then it's a job with a meaning as opposed to a job just anywhere. So anyway, anybody listening that's waiting to do orientation, look that up and you can impress me when we do the orientation. So thank you again for joining us today, Steve.
No problem. Thank you all for having me. And like I said, super excited to meet the rest of the team in Dallas.
And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.